Let's pray.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessing, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our soul.
I thought we would start today with the question that Deacon Stephen raised, and it seems like it's out of, sort of linear order of where we are, but everything's connected. And that's the beautiful thing about all of this, and what I've kind of repeated many times is that we look at the particular and we see the whole, and we look to the whole and we're drawn to the particular. So if you remember where we were on day 6. And on the 6th day, God says, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. And we talked a little bit about the image and likeness of man. And some of the paradoxes, one of the questions we raised, what does it mean to fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish and the birds and every living thing that moves upon the earth? And I raised the question, what does it mean to have dominion over the creatures if we don't eat them? What are we doing with them in our dominionness? And Deacon Stephen raised an interesting question, and then I pointed out that we don't eat them because at this stage in the creation story, the human person still eats strictly plants and fruits. Every plant yielding seed which is upon the face of the earth, every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And even the animals are considered to be vegans, essentially, at this stage of creation. So the question was, well, it's complicated, isn't it? Because we know that humans are given a blessing to eat meat when? Does anyone remember when that occurs? When do we first get a blessing to eat meat from God? Oh, well, yeah, that's where all things are made clean. Yep. But long before that, the blessing to eat meat, any kind of meat, is actually given at the end of the flood, when Noah comes off the ark. And for the first time we see scripturally the blessing to eat meat. Now what's interesting about that is we know sacrifices were being made before Noah's flood. So what were they doing with that? There's sort of silence on that question. But the question is, what do we eat and why? And one of the things that gets complicated, what Frank is mentioning, is Peter's vision in which all food is created clean. And that gets back to Deacon Stephen's question, what about this whole idea that there are foods that are clean and foods that are unclean? So there's certain types of animals that we eat. Well, not we, but this is, all right, back in Judaism before Christ. Certain animals that were eaten and certain other animals that were not. And what's the meaning of all that? And how does that all tie in to this idea of dominion? So first of all, I think that's a fascinating question, and it's worth just looking at why it is that some animals are considered clean and some animals are considered unclean. And then what does it mean that all are considered clean at the end? Which is mentioned in St. Peter's vision in the book of Acts. It's also mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, and I'll read that passage briefly. I mentioned a scholar named Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas is an anthropologist, interestingly. She's not a theologian, although she really should be a theologian because she's so excellent. She's an anthropologist, and she wrote a fascinating book called Leviticus as Literature. And once you know about this book, if you kind of read in these areas, you keep seeing everyone quoting Mary Douglas, because even though she was working in a sort of cross-disciplinary way, her insights into Leviticus were really, really astonishing, mainly because she simply let the text speak its own language whereas most commentators that approach books like Leviticus come in with all kinds of baggage, to be honest with you, all kinds of preconceived notions, and they bend things to fit an idea. And so she spends quite a bit of time looking at this whole question of what it meant for Israel to eat certain types of animals. And the way that this intersects with what we're talking about here is she reminds us that in Leviticus, this whole question of defiled and undefiled, clean and unclean, animals that you may eat and animals that you may not eat, these are all ritual categories. They're ritual categories. And remember what we've been saying about the creation story is that the creation story itself is a ritual category. It's given to us in the context of the liturgical gathering of Israel in the tabernacle, with the tabernacle being a microcosm of the whole cosmos, right? So just as creation and the creation story and everything we see going on is in a ritual context, so in Leviticus, this idea of what foods are clean and unclean is a ritual context. In other words, it's not saying, let's just take pig, because we all love eating pig. We all love bacon, right? Pig isn't bad in and of itself, is what she's saying. Pig is simply not chosen to be offered in the tabernacle. Okay? So, in other words, the difference between an animal that's clean and an animal that's unclean is that clean animals are chosen by God to be offered as sacrifices in the tabernacle, and therefore consumed by the priests and the people who have offered it. There's an interesting idea here that, in theory at least, in ancient Israel, you would never have eaten meat unless it had been sacrificed to God, to the God of Israel. In other words, you didn't say, well, I'll take 10% of my flock and I'll give that to the temple, and now I have all this other rest of the flock, and I'll just eat that as I wish. The meat that you ate was the meat that was offered in the temple. Now, that's in theory. I don't think that that's actually how it probably played out. But in theory, when you look at the law, the language, the ritual language, and the reason why this language is the way that it is about clean and unclean, animals that we eat, animals that we don't eat, is precisely because there are animals that are offered to God as an event of communion with Him, and there are other animals that we do not offer. So one of the categories is ungulates, those who chew the cud. So these are, think of a cow. He has a complete hoof. He doesn't have a split hoof. They eat grass, and they chew the cud, meaning, and this is a category in Leviticus, they chew the cud, meaning that they have this digestive system where they regurgitate what they've been chewing on so that they can chew on it some more, okay? There's three basic categories of the animals that are offered in the temple, and other animals that do chew the cud but have cloven hoofs, like camels, are not offered in the temple, and therefore they're not clean for the people to eat. Now, Mary Douglas points out there are entire civilizations in the ancient world that were founded upon the eating of camels. So it's not a question that, it's not saying for human beings you shouldn't eat camels. I've never eaten camel myself, but that's not what the text is worried about. The text isn't really worried about never eat pig. What the text is really emphasizing is that the role of the human being and the role of creation is to be offered to God. And so it needs to be offered to God in the right order, in the right balance. So there are, just like Israel is a tithe of humanity that is offered to God and receives His revelation, so there are some animals that are appropriate, i.e. clean, to be offered in the temple and consumed, and there are other animals that are not clean. And it doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean that they're cursed. It doesn't mean that there's something dangerous. A lot of theory about ancient prohibitions about eating pork is that pigs, the meat spoils very easily, or that it's dangerous, or they have more parasites than other creatures, or there's this idea that we shouldn't eat things that scavenge, although pretty much every animal scavenges. There's no such thing as an animal that doesn't scavenge if they get hungry enough. There's this revulsion principle in biblical interpretation where things we don't eat because it's just gross, you know. You can have this visceral reaction to why I wouldn't want to eat that sort of thing. And Douglas really says, look, if you really look at the whole scripture completely, none of that really holds up at the end. The only thing that holds up is recognizing that these are ritual categories, and therefore there are animals that we offer to God as an expression of our worship and as an expression, and this gets ahead of really talking about what does animal sacrifice mean in relation to the fall, and we will spend some time on that. But offering to God a sacrifice with the spilling of blood as an expression of our mortality and as a covering of our mortality. So that gets very complicated. I'm not prepared to talk about it today. There's animals that we eat and there's animals that we don't eat. And by the way, the other category of animals that we don't eat have nothing to do, interestingly enough, with animals that would or would not be offered in the temple. There's also prohibitions about eating the swarming things, insects and grubs and worms and a lot of sea creatures that are swarming. And she actually does this analysis, Mary Douglas does this analysis of that language in the Hebrew that suggests that the better translation should be teeming. And her interpretation of this, and this gets a little bit into Deuteronomy now, but her interpretation of not eating the swarming, teeming things of the earth, things that we really don't want to eat anyway. But honestly, I mean, like grasshoppers and that sort of thing. I mean, a lot of cultures eat bugs. A lot of cultures eat grubs and other sorts of things. That the prohibitions there have to do with creation level issues. And I wrote this down just so I got the language. What she essentially says is, do not eat what already belongs to God. Do not eat what already belongs to God and hasn't been offered by you to him. So teeming creatures are multiplying and filling the earth. That's a creation level creature and identity. They have a place in God's providence, and humans should not encroach on his designs. So I think that's a very fascinating idea. Everything has its place in creation. Everything has its purpose in God's creation. And the human occupies a central role as the image and likeness of God, as the priest of God, and as maybe we'll talk about this a little bit today, but we've said many times that the tabernacle temple is a microcosm of the whole world, and therefore to sanctify the temple is to sanctify creation. Well, also the human person and the human body is also a microcosm of all of creation. And there's a link, therefore, between the temple and the body. Where does God dwell? And you see this push and pull all throughout the history of any form of theology. Does God dwell in the building, or does God dwell in his people? And interestingly, from a biblical point of view, that it shouldn't be understood as an either-or question. There's a parallelism between the temple of the body, which we get a lot in the theology of St. Paul. Do you know that you are the temple of the living God? You are the temple of the Holy Spirit. God dwells within you. Christ says this. He and his Father make their home within our hearts. We are temples. Our bodies are temples. That's part of the goodness of creation and the very good. We haven't talked much about that, but every time God makes something, he declares it to be very good. And this is what we're drawing into about what animals may be eaten later after the fall and after the beginning of sanctioned blessing of the eating of meat after the flood, is that everything has its place, everything has its purpose, and everyone's supposed to stay within the balance of all of that. So that's what all that language is going for. And I find that interesting because it really then captures for us the mystery of what it means for us to be the image and likeness of God. We have a role within creation, and it's not simply to please ourselves. We're going to get to that. That's the fall. When we start to live for ourselves, that's when the fall occurs. We have a role within creation to live and serve God and all of creation. And so when we start to think about what does it mean to have dominion over the fish and the birds and the animals, even before we've eaten them, it's fulfilling this role. That eating the animals is, in a sense, a response to the fall itself. All right. Oh, and I mentioned, sorry, I don't want to get too far away from this because we'll lose our train of thought. Yeah, go ahead. With the blood still in them, yeah. Yeah, again, that's a great example of the prohibition. Who has been, I know some of you have been to Israel. Have you been to Israel? Yeah, you guys have been to Israel. Did you experience, if you wanted to, if you were in an establishment and you wanted coffee at breakfast and you wanted milk in your coffee, is this ringing, this isn't dinging a bell? Okay. So when I went to Israel, interestingly, if you wanted cream in your coffee, you couldn't have it in the main dining area. You had to go to a separate area if you wanted to add cream in your coffee. That's because there's a law that's saying you shall not, here I'm just paraphrasing, you shall not eat a kid boiled in its mother's milk, I think is the exact language. You shall not eat, in other words, a kid, a baby goat, or a baby lamb. You shall not eat a kid boiled in its mother's milk. What that really means is you should not eat pregnant animals. All right, so again, there's a commandment to all the creatures to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. All the creatures are supposed to do that. So the human cannot encroach on God's design. You cannot eat. You should never slaughter a pregnant cow or a pregnant sheep or a pregnant goat. All right, that's interesting. So what gets interesting, though, in Israel, and maybe they've even changed this, I don't know, but this is interpreted that if you have a dining facility where other animal products are being eaten, you cannot eat milk. You cannot consume dairy with other animal products. You have to keep them separate. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, okay, good. We have some corroboration here. Yes. Right. Yeah. So again, this is an example of what it means to eat kosher and what it means for Jews to eat in a clean way. But it all goes back to this fundamental idea that we're talking about, that there's order in creation. Now, we would say that that is at least from our perspective, a peculiar rabbinical interpretation of the prohibition of eating creatures in the mother's milk. What does that have to do with milk in my coffee? That's not the prohibition, but they've taken it as we need to keep these things separate. So they're keeping them separate, though. That's on a sort of creation level event because everything has its order. Frank, what was your question that triggered me thinking about the milk and the coffee? Oh yeah, so the other thing is blood. You don't eat blood. There's a very, very strict prohibition against eating blood. The blood, there's also a strict prohibition against eating certain portions of the fat of an animal. So this has to do, again, with the Lord's portion. The life is in the blood, and because the human has squandered life through the fall, through turning away from communion with God, and what underlies all of these things is that all food is communion with God. All food is communion with God. The blood is spilled and scattered upon the altar, not the altar in the Holy of Holies at the temple or the tabernacle, but there's a front altar, an altar of sacrifice. The blood has to be drained and spilled. The fat and certain portions of the animal are burned on that altar and those are considered God's portion, Yahweh's portion. And then other portions are given to the priests, and then so other portions are given to the people who offered that animal. So all these prohibitions have to do with whose portion is involved in the communion, okay? You know, it's very similar to if you gather for Thanksgiving and you've got extended family and there's sort of a seat that's at the head of the table. There's someone who belongs in that seat, you know? The 14-year-old boy slides into that seat and thinks he's going to be the head of the family. No, get out of there, you know? Granddad goes there. There's an order to where people sit. There's an order to how people are served and who is served first. All of those things, even more so in the ancient world. And so all of that has to get back to this idea of food and order within food. You know, just another way that we practically experience this is that we, as Christians, we have this tradition of blessing our food. Why do we bless food? You know, we're going to have divine liturgy here. We're going to go through all the singing and prayers and actions, and we're going to sanctify, and the gifts of bread and wine will be transformed into body and blood, and we're going to receive that as an event of communion with God. But then we're going to go downstairs and we're going to make sure we bless that chili. Why are we blessing the chili? Because all food is communion with God. All food is communion with God. It is considered irreverent for any human person to simply take food for themselves, as if their own physical needs trump their relationship with God. And that's why we're constantly bringing food. Food is like the foundation level of the spiritual life, which is so strange and paradoxical to say. But you can't have spiritual life if you don't deal with food. Because food has life in it, and life is a gift from God, and therefore the consumption of food is a receiving of life and referring that life to God. And this is the fundamental role of the human person in creation, to take what is living and to refer it in its proper way and order back to God. That's a fundamental priestly movement, a priestly motion, to take all things and refer them back to God. So again, that's why there are certain things that are referred back to God and then eaten, but everything is referred back to God even if it's not eaten. And that gets back then to what is dominion without eating the thing that you have dominion over. It's bringing order. It's spreading order. You know, God's commandment to the human person is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Fill the earth. And what's interesting about that is he puts them in a garden, but then he says, I want you to fill the earth. I want that in a sense. Is he saying leave the garden? No. He's saying expand the garden. He puts the human person in the garden to keep it and till it so that the garden expands its boundaries and all of the earth is brought into the glorious harmony of paradise itself. There's a lot of mystery there, but that's the fundamental movement of our understanding of what the human being is as the image and creation of the image and likeness of God. To go and fill the earth. Again, it's not to live for ourselves. It's not to create some purely human civilization. It's to spread the civilization of the worship of God and bring everything into its order. Now, just very briefly, hear me, all of you, and understand, our Lord says. This is Mark 7:14. There is nothing outside a man which by going into him can defile him, but the things which come out of a man are what defile him. And then they ask for understanding, what are you talking about? Like our whole religious system is to avoid eating something that defiles us. So Christ then clarifies, do you not see that whatever goes into a man from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and so passes on? Thus he declared all foods clean. Now, interestingly, is that a later editorial comment added to the gospel text at that point? But all foods are declared clean. Why? Because Christ is saying what you eat can't defile you. So this is really interesting when it goes back to why why you can't have milk in your coffee in Israel. The fear of defiling. If I eat the wrong foods in the wrong place, I'll be defiled. And what Jesus is saying is, no, that's not correct. He's interpreting the law correctly in the face of many centuries, even his own time, of misinterpretation. It's not the food that defiles you. What comes out of a man is what defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, fornication, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a man. So we could talk a lot about this, but what I think is really interesting is that it really captures Douglas's own understanding of clean and unclean foods. It's not that the unclean foods in and of themselves cause defilement. It's that they're simply not chosen to be offered to God in the tabernacle. And therefore, if all meat that theoretically you are to eat is the meat that you offer is the animal that you offer in the tabernacle, then you cannot eat those animals without falling into a disorder, in a sense. But what Christ is saying, and what the New Testament is saying, now all foods are declared clean, is that by Christ's own self-offering, that offering to God and the spreading of life and the spreading of paradise is completed in him, and therefore it no longer matters to have these distinctions. Okay? In other words, it's Christ's own self-sacrifice of the cross. This whole ritual understanding of what can be eaten and what can't be eaten is superseded. It's completed, in a sense. It's not denied, but it's completed. So now you can eat all things. But then we get into a paradox with that, and that is that very quickly, the spiritual ideal of how the Christian would be to eat would be to avoid most animal products altogether. Not quite veganism, but vegetarianism, if you consider a diet primarily of plants and fruits and nuts and seeds and grains and dairy products and eggs and probably fish. All right? In other words, what our monastics eat today, they never eat meat. Why should we have this idea if all foods are clean, and not only can we eat cows and sheep and chickens, but we can eat that sloth. We can eat the pig. We can eat the cockroach. We can eat whatever we want. All foods have declared clean, and none of these foods in themselves cause us harm. The cockroach maybe, I don't know, but none of them in and of themselves cause us harm. Why wouldn't we eat them? Again, this gets to the fact that there's something deeper behind all of that. And that is our place in creation. It's the place of every creature in creation. And it's the order of the spreading of paradise into all the world. That is the original civilization. The original civilization, and this gets very fascinating when we look at ancient civilizations and their connection to their rituals. But the original civilization is the civilization of the temple at the heart of paradise, into which Adam is enthroned as the first high priest. This is the whole imagery and language of Genesis and creation that is inherent to the Jewish vision of reality, and also to the Christian, because great saints like Ephraim the Syrian and many others have connected all these things to the Christian church as well. That the original civilization, the garden, is not simply a garden where you do nothing but stand around and eat. The garden itself is a dynamic place of relationship. It's a dynamic place of fulfillment. It's a dynamic place where everything comes together and finds its purpose and works in harmony to the glory of God, who pours out his life from the foundation of the world. That is what the image of paradise is. That's what the image of the human being in paradise. And we've got to keep that in mind before we get to the fall. Because we won't get the fall very well if we don't understand from what the human being fell from. Or that grammatically was all wrong. From what we fell is what we would say. We won't really understand the fall. It's fruit, you can't eat this, you can't eat that. Oh, okay, something else is going on there. There's order. And it's not that one is bad and one is good. The serpent is going to come in. We'll get to this just in a few weeks. The serpent's going to come in, and he's going to introduce disorder into the human relationship with God. And what is the medium of that disorder? Food. Eating the wrong food at the wrong time. The food you were commanded not to eat. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that fascinating? So it all goes back to this idea of paradise, not as simply a garden, but as a place of dynamic relationship, a dynamic revelation of God and the sharing of God's life with his people. And the first human, who is a male-female unity, right? That's also part of the creation story. Let us create man in our image, male and female, he created them. That means that the full human image is always a male and a female reality. And there's all kinds of things we can talk about when we start to get these categories confused, as they are obviously greatly confused in our own time. But there's a reason for it. It's not politics. It's not, trying to get back to 1950s ideal nuclear family America. It's creation level stuff. When you start misunderstanding male and female, you start messing with the very fabric of creation. Which is why our teaching doesn't change on that, despite all the pressure from the outside to do precisely that. Let me stop there. It's almost time for ours. Are there any other questions? Anything else that anyone has? Yeah.
Was everything that was sacrificed then intended to be consumed?
Yes. It was either burned or consumed.
Okay, because like when they would say about offering the pigeons and the turtle doves, there's not much there.
Yeah.
A portion already
Right.
doesn't leave a whole lot.
Right. And I wonder if some of the birds that were small, there are, certainly in England, you'll eat pigeon, If you go to a good pub, you can order some pigeon with your pint.
Cornish hen.
Cornish hen, yeah. So you can certainly eat those birds, but a lot of times the sacrifices themselves were simply burnt. There's another whole image of this that Douglas talks about in her book about this weird language that when we talk of a burnt offering, which is a holocaust, right? And that's where the word Holocaust comes from. A holocaust is a temple term for a burnt offering. A burnt offering, we think, oh, it's kind of cooked. But the Hebrew actually suggests that it's turned to smoke. And there's an interesting then caution about interpreting smoke and incense as being the same thing, that there are certain things that are turned to smoke. But yeah, so the question is, what do they do with all the animals? They're either eaten or they're turned to smoke. They're offered up to God. There are portions that are taken outside the camp and disposed of out there, portions that cannot be eaten or consumed further. The law sort of covers every part of the animal. This is God's portion, the priest's portion, the family that offered it, that's their portion, and then other parts that are burnt completely or turned to smoke, and then other parts that are taken outside and dealt with out there as well. Yeah, but it is, I think we gravely misunderstand the sacrificial system if we don't start with the understanding that it's a big old feast. It's a place where you're eating animals. That's what the temple is. And who are you communing with? You're communing with God. And that's the fundamental meaning of all sacrifice. Yes? Yes. No, the animals are butchered right there so that their blood can be caught and sprinkled on the altar of offering. Yeah, so part of the priesthood was apparently having pretty decent knife skills. Yeah, you would have to not only slaughter the animal, but then butcher it and disembowel it and clean it, and all of that's involved. That was a priestly act. Yep. Okay. Next week, I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to be in St. Vlad's all week doing D-Min stuff, and it's going to be pretty intense. But I'm going to assume that I will definitely be back, but I'm going to assume that I will have a few moments to sort of prepare some things for next week. So just assume that we'll have class next week, and if I'm really desperate, I'll stand up here and ask for your forgiveness.